Matthew.
Thank you, sir. Good to have John Tucker with us. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. Here on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power. It's only Tuesday. We've already covered a lot of news here in the first 20 minutes. With an eye on Baltimore, I do want to mention here, as we bring you coverage in the way that Bloomberg would, we're looking at, of course, the economic impact, the impact here on life in the Amtrak corridor, never mind the rescue operation that is, of course, underway. We're still looking for 6 people, construction workers, who were on the Key Bridge when it came down at 1:30 in the morning, having been struck by a cargo ship. We're going to hear from Joe Biden soon. And when he speaks, we'll, of course, bring you the president's remarks live on Bloomberg Radio and on YouTube. Currently scheduled to begin about 7 minutes from now, but this has been a fluid situation. The president heading to North Carolina today was expected to speak about an hour ago, but they moved the remarks to this hour. Again, we'll bring them to you when we get there, and we'll have a lot more on the bridge over the course of the program. Big deal today that we've been talking about with our buddy Nathan Dean for months and months. It actually came to fruition in the form of an important settlement. Visa and MasterCard agreeing to cap credit card swipe fees, and what we are framing as one of the most significant antitrust settlements ever. Nathan is with us now. It's good to see you from Bloomberg Intelligence. This has been something important to Joe Biden. We talk about fees and eliminating junk fees and so forth, but a huge deal for the credit card industry that didn't want any part of this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is a $30 billion settlement, and obviously from Visa and MasterCard's standpoint, they've agreed to temporarily, through 2030, reduce the amount of caps, which is on what's called credit card interchange fees. So This is actually fees. A lot of this is going to the banking industry. So the banks are not going to be happy about this. Now, the reason why Washington is involved here also is because Senator Dick Durbin from Illinois has this bill out there called the Credit Card Competition Act. And this is part of the junk fee proposal from the Biden administration, the junk fee executive order, and all this talk about additional competition and so forth to try and lower these fees even more. Now, what I think will happen here is I don't think Senator Durbin is going to give up on his act because of this. You know, this is, like I said before, only goes through 2030. Okay. And while the $30 billion is significant, it doesn't structurally change that Visa and MasterCard dominate the network for this. Mm-hmm. I think, however, what this will do is maybe make it a little bit harder for additional supporters to come on board, because, you know, anybody who's been following this issue, or if anybody has a credit card that is using airline miles, you know that these reward programs could be at risk if this bill goes forward. And I just still think that when you put an issue against the retailers, against the banks, against YouTube travelers and vloggers, you know, I think this is something that Congress just doesn't know what they want to do yet.
Well, that's going around, isn't it? I mean, I could name any issue on the to-do list and you could answer it almost the same way. Having funded the government, apparently at great peril to the Speaker of the House, there's a question about what else could happen this year. The tax deal that was struck between the House and Senate appears to be on ice. And then there's Ukraine, and that might be the answer after Easter based on what we're hearing from the Speaker.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Speaker Johnson said that, you know, he is committed to putting a vote to some form of Ukraine aid, not obviously the Senate deal that was put through earlier. You know, we've talked about on this program before this idea of an interest-free loan that President Trump has somewhat backed. But then comes the question of the motion to vacate and whether or not Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene is going to eventually move through, you know, with this motion to vacate if Speaker Johnson moves to the floor with the Ukraine aid. So I think they're on a 2-week recess right now. After Easter, they'll come back. I think some form of Ukraine aid will make it to the floor. Representative McCall said this just yesterday that he thinks that some form of it will come. But I think the next 2 weeks for Speaker Johnson is trying to float out a pathway to avoid this motion to vacate. Because even though we've had Democrats say that they would be willing to help the Speaker, that comes with a price tag.
Not making that bet.
And,
sure.
Yeah, and obviously a Republican Speaker of the House doesn't want to have his job just because of Democrats from New York, you know, backing you up here.
Don't make me have to do this, guys.
Exactly.
AOC said it best maybe on Sunday morning. Yeah, we'll help them out, but we're not doing it for free.
Exactly.
So what would be the cost? Is it a power sharing agreement that would essentially leave the Speaker with no authority?
No, I don't think it will go that far because, if he does need Democratic votes, we're only talking a handful. I mean, we're not talking like a large amount here. I think a commitment to bringing Ukraine aid and Israel aid to the floor by a certain time could get a lot of those folks on board. But again, the optics are bad. But when it comes to the rest of the year, I hate saying this to clients because November is so long away, but April is Ukraine. You've got May, June, a little bit of July.
Right.
They're out for August. They're out for October. September will be another CR fight. There's not a lot of time left to get other stuff done. It's going to be really interesting to see how much time this Ukraine package takes, because there's a whole host of other smaller legislation out there like crypto and stable coins and the tax bill that you were talking about that's just waiting for this to get resolved.
And may never see the light of day, I guess, in this Congress. But how are we looking at this motion to vacate? Marjorie Taylor Greene, okay. You didn't go to the floor. You didn't make that a privileged resolution. So are we not just raising money here? I realize she says Ukraine is the hook. But if you're Speaker Mike Johnson, don't you call the bluff?
You know, Speaker Johnson has called the bluff several times before, and he's still Speaker.
That's right.
You know, obviously things can always change. And, you know, a motion to vacate fight, Speaker Johnson knows, is not something the Republican Party wants to have 5-6 months before the elections. So if I'm Speaker Johnson, it's all about flexibility and options and trying to avoid that motion to vacate, because there is no good solution that comes from that, even if he keeps his job. You know, you're either going to keep your job through Democrat support, or, you know, it's just going to be another few weeks of us watching C-SPAN trying to figure out who's going to be the next speaker. Nothing good comes from that. So if I'm Speaker Johnson, I'm going to feel things out, try and see, keep all options open, potentially see if I can get President Trump on my side. If I go with President Trump's interest-free loan deal, would Marjorie Taylor Greene do a motion to vacate on something President Trump supports?
Well, these are great questions. Could that actually emerge in legislative form? Is that what could be cooked up in this recess?
I think it's one of the options. I mean, the easiest option would be to take the Senate bill, tweak it, send it back to him. But, you know, I think that Speaker Johnson is just looking at a lot of different things right now. Representative McCall, you know, even just said yesterday that he's had conversations. Lindsey Graham has said that he's had conversations on this. So I think, honestly, what's happening right now is, you know, you talk with the Ukraine aid, you know, and for the investment portfolio, remember, most of this aid is going to go to U.S. defense contractors and so forth like that. But you talk with the idea that we think Ukraine aid will get done. We do think it's going to be a multi-billion-dollar package deal. But the question is the details, the semantics, and how it gets through. But I do think it will happen in April.
Yeah. We're spending time with Nathan Dean from Bloomberg Intelligence as we wait to hear from President Obama. We have our eyes on the Roosevelt Room right now in the White House, where the podium has been set up. Reporters will be in position here when the president decides to speak. We'll bring remarks live here specific to the bridge collapse earlier today in Baltimore. You know, we spent so much time talking about infrastructure in the first 2 years of Joe Biden's tenure here as president. And it turns out this really is not an infrastructure story. This bridge was up to code, according to Wes Moore. So you wonder to what extent there's a Washington angle here beyond simply funding local governments.
Well, I think it's going to be our federal funds deviated to help with this bridge. I mean, I was looking at some of the, and I can't remember if it was the Bush administration or if it was the Clinton administration, but I was reading a story this morning on Bloomberg about how there was a bridge collapse, and within 3 days, Congress had already deviated $250 million via unanimous consent through the Senate to replace that. So, you know, don't be surprised. I don't think anything's going to move that quickly because they're on recess. But, you know, infrastructure is something that, you know, I think this is going to be a wake-up call for a Biden second term, if you will, because there's there's so many bridges that have to be replaced. I mean, you have the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that went through the Bipartisan Act. Then you have the Inflation Reduction Act. So there was, remember, every week here was Infrastructure Week.
Absolutely.
There are so many bridges that need to be replaced in the United States. And obviously this was not, bad code or anything like that. You know, it wouldn't be surprised to see another round at trying to get a little bit more infrastructure money in a second Biden term.
And then you're going to hear from Republicans who said, we told you we needed more for roads, bridges, and tunnels. So, a lot of that bill went to broadband internet, a lot of things.
Yeah, and like with any infrastructure bill, you know, there's a price tag and it'll come down, and there's inflationary aspects that you have to think about. So I'm not saying this is going to happen, but I could see that this could be the rolling of a certain momentum that in a second Biden term.
I think it's really smart.
You know, let's do the, it's like the highway bill. You know, the highway bill that comes out every few years. You know, it doesn't really get to the point where I can talk about it on Bloomberg Radio, but it's also very important because it's tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars that flow out. And as a remember, for any investor who's watching this, the most important companies that comes to any type of infrastructure deal are mom and pop companies. It's not the high publicly traded firms,
Yeah.
like the John Deere's and the so forth.
yeah.
They get the downfall impact a couple of years later, but it's these mom and pop companies out in Peoria, Illinois and Topeka, Kansas that are the ones that get the contracts for building those roads and building those bridges. And then on an 18-month or 2-year cycle, they'll buy equipment to deal with that. So if there is an infrastructure bill, and again, it's a long, I'm talking a year from now or 2 years from now, if there is an infrastructure bill and you're trying to figure out how to plan for your publicly traded portfolio, it's usually a 2-year.
This is fascinating. I think we're going to play this tape back. Infrastructure 2.0. If Joe Biden gets reelected, it makes an enormous amount of sense. He sees it as the great accomplishment of his first term, and it plays well. He always makes the joke out there, oh, these Republicans are happy to take the money even though they voted against it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, anybody who's driven on a highway, even under the Bush administration, you can remember those signs saying paid for
Absolutely,
by,
yes.
this infrastructure deal. And look, everybody knows a bridge. Everybody knows a road. And, obviously I would, there's a human element to the bridge collapse today.
Of course.
But for the folks that use that bridge for commuting, they're going to see fairly quickly how that's going to change. And like we saw earlier this year in Philadelphia, how quickly policymakers came together to fix the bridge in Philadelphia.
That's right.
It's good politics.
And actually managed to innovate while they were at it. And you wonder if that's what we're going to be in for here. Waiting to hear from Joe Biden, is going to be speaking to this bridge collapse in just a moment from the White House. Unclear if he'll take questions. He's on his way out of town. He's going to be back on the road today to North Carolina, likely, by the way, Nathan, talking about his accomplishments, including infrastructure. It is amazing how this stuff just keeps coming around.
Yeah, the one thing I will say, though, is that infrastructure comes, there's this discussion, but if President Trump wins in November, we think the Inflation Reduction Act is safe. However, there are a lot of green energy tax credits in there that could be at risk. And so if you're exposed to the solar industry, for example, my colleague Rob Barnett has a lot of notes out there talking about how solar, like for solar and so, for example, a lot of their long-term earnings are baked onto this idea that
they're booked because of the IRA.
Exactly. So, two scenarios I think could play out if President Trump wins. The first one is they just try and repeal. Now, I think that's easier said when you're not in power, but when you are in power, it's going to be harder because, like you said before, a lot of Republican districts are getting money from the Inflation Reduction Act.
Hard to claw back.
However, President Trump could, if on his first day, decide to do an executive order that tweaks a lot of the tax incentives, because the IRA was $500 billion in new spending, but there was a lot of tax incentives that the IRS and the Treasury Department could start tweaking immediately. So, from an infrastructure perspective, that clean energy aspect could be, I don't want to say at risk, but at risk of change.
Fascinating.
If President Trump wins in November.
So we get closer. Polls show this being Trump's race to lose. Keep your eye on First Solar shares.
I would say the clean energy, the energy policy in particular, because
EV makers.
EV makers and so forth like that. And a lot of it's going to be on the regulatory side.
Yeah.
So it's not going to be an immediate change. If President Trump puts out an executive order on day one, 90% of those executive orders will be directing his agencies to do something. And that takes 12 to 18 months, if not longer. So I don't think there'd be an immediate impact, but energy is certainly one of those sectors to watch.
To do something or undo something, as the case may be. It's great to see you, Nathan. Thank you, as always. Always my great pleasure to spend time with Nathan Dean at Bloomberg Intelligence. We are his client here on Balance of Power, just like those who use the terminal. Find him on the terminal, BI, and at Bloomberg.com.